Welcome, students. Today we're going to continue our discussion of influence and power. So I'll start by talking in more detail about Cialdini's 6 principles of influence. Then we'll talk about different sources of power, and we'll finish with a discussion of ethics. So that's the plan for this lecture. Okay, let's start. So, Cialdini, in his book named Influence, identified 6 different principles by which we can try to influence other people. And so I'd like to go through each of those 6 principles. First is reciprocity. And so, a little background info here. So we're social primates. We've evolved to live in social groups. And as a result, we're kind of quite sensitive to a number of social issues, and in particular, reciprocity is one. So if a person does something for us, we tend to feel a sense of obligation to do something in return for them. So you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and based on this sort of need that we have, there are a few specific techniques that one can use to try to persuade somebody, to influence somebody. The first is what's called door in the face, which is where you ask for a large request from somebody, knowing that it's going to be refused. And after they refuse your large request, you ask for a smaller request, and that's more likely to be granted than if you had not asked for the large request first. So the way this works is when you ask for something big, people might, generally people are going to say no. And then if you ask for something small, you've kind of moderated your position. So you're no longer asking for that big thing. You've kind of changed your position. You're accommodating them. You're doing them a favor in a sense by asking for something smaller. And so as a result of that, you've done something for them. They feel an obligation to do something for you. So they're more likely to say yes to that smaller request. Similarly, there's the that's not all strategy that you see in infomercials where before, you sort of, here's the product, and then before people have a chance to say yes or no, you sweeten the deal immediately. So you're, again, giving something extra to that person that makes them more likely to feel obliged to do something for you. In other words, to buy the products. You see that in marketing. Giving a small gift is another way to increase the chances of somebody saying yes to your request or agreeing to what you're asking them to do. And so this is, it can be useful when, for example, as a manager, you're trying to push a particular idea that you have, maybe trying to implement a new change, whatever it might be. So, giving a gift or sort of doing something, doing a favor for somebody, or highlighting the fact that you've done a favor for somebody in the past is a way that you might make them feel more obligation to reciprocate, to agree to what you are asking them to do. Of course, we have to be careful that we do this in a way that isn't manipulative. Otherwise, people aren't going to like that. So one easy way to take advantage of reciprocity in the big picture, take advantage sounds like cynical, but this is the opposite of cynical here. The advice is to be a giver. So the more you're helpful to other people, genuinely helpful, not helpful because you want to get something out of them in the future, but just that if you're a helpful person, if you're a giver, if you're the kind of person who goes out of their way for other people, then you build what we call idiosyncrasy credits, which are kind of this like social currency that you can accumulate. And basically, if you do a bunch of favors for other people, then you've accumulated this resource that you can then use when you really need favors from other people. So, Adam Grant wrote a book fairly recently about this principle, which he called Give and Take, very easy read, definitely worth doing. And the other nice thing about being a giver, particularly as a manager, is that you're then acting as a social model to other people. In other words, if your employees see you going out of your way to help other people, then they're more likely to model their own behavior after you. And so if you have a culture where everyone's giving, then basically everyone wins. And that's the kind of culture that generally we tend to want at work. So that's reciprocity. Second principle is scarcity. So again, as animals, we're concerned with securing and gathering food supplies. That's evolved into us. And we don't want to feel regret for missing opportunities that are, available only for a short period of time or are only available in a particular quantity. And so you see this in marketing all the time with the deadline technique. So, limited time offer, there's a deadline, there's a 1-day sale, whatever it might be, or limited number of techniques. So the offer is available while supplies last, implying that supplies are dwindling. And if you don't act soon, you're going to miss out. And so from a management standpoint, what we want to do in terms of our influence attempts is to highlight the maybe unique benefits of whatever it is that you're offering or the exclusive information that you're providing. Highlight the rarity, the scarcity of what it is that you're, providing as a manager. And that's a way to, increase your ability to influence other people. Third principle is consistency. So we tend to feel uncomfortable when our attitudes and behaviors are inconsistent with each other, or when our attitudes are inconsistent with other attitudes that we hold, or when our past behaviors are inconsistent with our present or future behaviors. So this is a principle called cognitive dissonance that you may have heard of. And understanding that people want to feel like they're consistent allows you to exert influence on people. And so you see this in marketing in a number of different ways. One particular tactic is called foot in the door, which is where if you ask for a small favor from somebody, then they're more likely to grant you another small favor, and so on and so forth until maybe we're getting bigger and bigger favors. But they look in the past and say, well, I helped you out here, so I guess I'll keep helping you. That's a way to gain influence. You see this in car sales, for example. There's a technique called lowballing, in which you go to a car sales lot and you find a car that you like, and the salesperson you're dealing with says, all right, I can give you this price on it, but this is a really good price, and I just have to double check, with my manager to make sure it's okay. And that's, a price that you're comfortable with and you're happy about it because it's way less than the ticket price. So in your head, you're sort of envisioning yourself in the car. You've already bought the car. You've convinced yourself how much you've made a good decision. And then what happens? The salesperson comes back and says, hey, gee, I'm really sorry. My boss is not letting me give you that price. But instead, I can give you the car for this price, and it's only X amount higher. And so instead of thinking, what was the price I was willing to pay on the car, you're thinking, well, that X amount is only this much more. And so you're more willing, you're more likely to say yes to that. So that's called lowballing. Now, how do we use this principle in management? The consistency principle, that is, well, make your commitments and make other people's commitments active, public, and voluntary. So an important idea here is if you've made an agreement with your manager, your boss, your employees, try to get those agreements in writing so that you can show people, hey, look, this is what you agreed to, or have people commit to supporting you in public. Make sure that people are voluntarily doing this. These are all ways to increase the extent to which you're going to be influential. Fourth principle is called consensus or social proof. And again, we're social animals. We feel comfortable when other people have done something in the past. We feel more comfortable doing that thing ourselves. So we prefer to do what other people have already done. And this takes a couple different forms. So there's what's called injunctive norms. So a norm, again, is an expected standard of behavior. Injunctive norms are norms for what one ought to do. Okay, so we all know that, if you have trash, you should throw it in a trash can. That's the injunctive norm. That's what we ought to do. And, that has some value. But descriptive norms are really actually the ones that are more consistent with this idea of consensus. And descriptive norms are what is actually done. So if you go to a subway platform in New York City, there are trash cans there. There's a lot of trash on the ground too. And so the injunctive norm is, yeah, we should throw trash in the trash can. But the descriptive norm, if you just look around, is, well, people are just throwing trash on the ground. And so what do you think is more powerful of the two, the injunctive norm or the descriptive norm? Well, not surprisingly, we're much more influenced by descriptive norms, what people have actually done, than what we know we're supposed to do. Okay, so one application of this principle to managers is that if you have a new idea, a new intervention, a new practice that you're trying to implement in your work group, the first thing you need to do is find a champion among your employees, somebody who is going to be on board from the get-go. And that might involve you kind of figuring out who's most likely to go along with you and then approaching them privately and getting them on board. So that when you announce your new idea or your new implementation, your new practice, that person's going to be the first person to say, yeah, I'm with you on this. And that provides a descriptive norm. It also provides an injunctive norm. So if they can argue, hey, this is why we should do this, and I'm on board, then people are more likely to follow the lead, especially if that champion is already an influential and respected person among the employees. Okay, and so here's the sort of some of the ironic pictures related to injunctive versus descriptive norms. Okay. Fifth principle is liking. We listen to people we like, and we're more likely to agree to people we like. We like people for a lot of different reasons. One, because they're more attractive to us, and attractiveness can take a couple different forms. So we have similarity as a basis for attractiveness. We like people who are similar to us. So one thing you can do as a manager is to try to develop the similarities, find similarities with your coworkers, develop these, find areas where you have similar interests with people and they're more likely to like you. That's one way. Another way is, in fact, just to sort of praise somebody. So it's really easy to get somebody to like you by saying nice things about them. In the minds of the person who's being praised, they think, oh, that person's really nice, and boy, they have really great judgment because they think nice things about me. So they must be, the kind of person that I would want to be friends with and, have a professional relationship with. So that's one basis for liking, in terms of attractiveness again. Another is back to that idea of idiosyncrasy credit. So if you're going out of your way to help other people, even when you don't have to, and even when maybe there's no benefit to you directly, that builds up idiosyncrasy credits, that makes people like you more. And again, and that beyond liking, it also people tend to trust people who are helpful, builds goodwill. So these are all things that help in terms of then making you more believable when you ask people to do something, making you more influential. And so when you've built up enough idiosyncrasy credits, then you might be able to exchange them in return for a relatively extraordinary request. In other words, if you are asking people to make small changes, yeah, people tend not to like them, but if you're persuasive enough, that might work. But if you're asking people for a big change, boy, you really need to be influential. And that's where building up these credits over time, even if you don't know when you might ever use them, generally speaking, as a long-term strategy, it's a good approach. And by the way, when we help people, we also tend to put ourselves in positions where we're being challenged to learn new things, to think about different ideas, think about different solutions. And so from a developmental standpoint, helping people, even though it might increase our workload, from a developmental standpoint, it's probably good. As long as the helping is sort of task related. If we have helping in the form of providing social support, listening to people's grievances, gripes, complaints about their boss, etc., that tends to be less developmentally beneficial to us. It might be a nice thing to do, but it also can be quite draining and doesn't necessarily develop you as an individual. Okay, anyway, then we have the sixth principle, which is authority, and this is otherwise known as the doctor effect. So, we tend to just agree with and be influenced by people who have authority or perceived authority. As a manager, do you have authority? Well, that depends. Depends on your credibility. So again, back to that idea of idiosyncrasy credit, as well as how competent you are, a bunch of things that go into credibility. And one way to make use of this principle is, for example, when you've graduated from CSUN, you have your diploma, you have a job. Are you going to hang your degree in your office? It might seem a little bit odd, but that having a degree hanging on the wall, especially from a great institution like CSUN, that is an advertisement of your authority. You've put in the time, you have a degree, you have expertise, and probably it might help a little bit when it comes to influencing other people. Okay. So those are Cialdini's 6 principles. Now, there are a few other principles of influence that bear discussion. And one is is the question of whether it's effective to try to influence people using fear as the basis for the influence. And so we do see this quite a bit, but there are specific circumstances under which they tend to work. And in really most other circumstances, they tend not to work or actually even to backfire. So it's a risky strategy to try to persuade somebody by making them afraid, but it can work. So when do they work best? Well, basically when the dangers that you're mentioning, that you're highlighting, are severe, when the person that you're targeting is highly susceptible to those dangers. Okay, in other words, it's hard to convince somebody to get, like wildfire insurance if they live on the East Coast where there really aren't any wildfires, right? So it's not just that the dangers are severe, they have to be applicable to the person you're trying to convince. You need to also, kind of give people the impression that they have control over the situation. So that's really important, because if you say, well, wildfires are really dangerous and you're living in an area where there are wildfires, but there's nothing you can do about it, well, you're probably not really going to convince them or like, you can't afford the insurance I'm trying to sell you. Obviously, that's not going to be effective. So people have to believe that they can do something to avoid the dangers. Fear appeals tend to be more effective when we're talking about one-time behaviors, like maybe buying insurance, or hey, agreeing to, maybe there's a workplace safety policy that everyone ignores. Well, maybe you're trying to convince people, look, you always have to wear a hard hat every time you go into the warehouse. Again, are the dangers severe? Yes. Is the person highly susceptible to them? Even if you're in a warehouse for 1 minute, you can still have something fly off a machine and hit you in the head. Are you able to put your helmet on? Yes, we've shown you how to do that. And it's more effective when we're talking about that discrete kind of behavior than something more general. So you might convince people of the dangers of not exercising, but that's a harder sell. It's harder to motivate behavior. It's hard to be afraid of having a heart attack constantly. It just doesn't work that well. And then finally, the other part is, if you make people too afraid, then it doesn't tend to work that well. So you want to make sure that you don't overload people with fear. Okay, it has to be fairly low level fear for it to be effective. Okay, because they can backfire. And I'll give you an example of one video that arguably backfires.
Smoking marijuana impairs your judgment. It's more harmful than we all thought.
Okay, yeah, the problem there, all right, if the idea is that you're trying to scare parents into, making sure their kids don't smoke marijuana, the connection between smoking marijuana and getting pregnant is probably not sufficiently clear there. So that's a problem. Now, other problems that you might see with other highly, fear-based appeals is that if people are so freaked out by your message, then they won't really be able to effectively process any information that comes after. So you see some of this with, in some contexts in organizations where you have real existential problems. If people are too focused on the scary possibilities, then people just get too freaked out and can't really understand your message. They become immobilized with anxiety. They might feel helpless, and so they might want to, in fact, avoid thinking about the issue at all, more than be motivated to deal with it. And so you see this in some work contexts. You also see this, for example, arguably with climate change, where clearly there are some projected horrible possible outcomes of climate change. But if you focus too much on those like sort of existential disaster related possible outcomes, that might be so scary for some people that they just sort of tune out the rest and maybe feel like, oh, this is horrible. There's nothing we can do about it. I'd rather just think about something else. So we have to be very careful when we try to use fear as a basis for appeal. And if your message to your employees is something to the effect of, get in line or else you're going to be fired, that might be a circumstance in which people are so afraid of getting fired that they're immobilized with anxiety. They feel helpless. They want to try to avoid the issue entirely. This is not a recipe for good performance. Okay. Now, on the other side of the coin, possibly, we have the use of humor in an attempt to influence some people. Now, there are some benefits. So if you are presenting your message with some humor in there, well, it can increase attention paid to the message. It can make people like you. Those are both going to have positive effects. But if you're too funny, then in fact, the humor might interfere with people otherwise understanding your message and direct attention away from what it is you're trying to convince them to do. So humor can work, particularly if it makes people like you more, but you got to be careful to make sure that it's humor that's relevant to the message that you're telling and that it's not sort of too over the top. Okay, so that's influence. Now let's move on to power. So power is the ability to influence or control other people. So we talked about different strategies for exerting influence on other people. You could think of power as a kind of basis or source of influence. And partly power comes from dependence. So when people rely on you for certain resources or information or people or decisions, access to all of these things, people rely on you and you have control over these things, then people can be said to be dependent on you for those things. And that dependence is a source of power. The flip side is if you as an individual are dependent for important things on other people, then you might feel a sense of powerlessness in which you don't have autonomy and you feel like you can't really participate in decisions that are leading to important outcomes to you. And that's, generally speaking, not a good feeling to have. So we want our employees to feel empowered to the extent possible, because that means they're going to take responsibility over their work. They're going to be motivated intrinsically and a bunch of other good things. Okay. Whistleblowing is another interesting topic that's related to power. And you can think of whistleblowing as removing another person's power. So usually this comes up when we talk about, for example, ethical scandals in organizations, maybe practices that are unethical or dangerous or risky. And, a well-intentioned employee might say, hey, look, this is going on. This is bad. We need to stop this. In other words, that employee is engaging in whistleblowing. And the idea there is that partly that might involve removing another person's power. So if you're whistleblowing that your boss is doing unethical things, that's an attempt to remove their power. And that might be very good for the organization, meaning like in the long term, it might be, and often is, good to have whistleblowers because they highlight things that are risk factors for organizations. But unfortunately, people tend to treat whistleblowers really badly. And there's lots of examples of this, both in organizational contexts and outside of organizational contexts. So you might have, fairly recently, depending on when you're watching this video, Christine Blasey Ford was a whistleblower and bringing to light some accusations of sexual assault against Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice, and arguably she was not treated particularly well as a whistleblower. Okay, so where do we get power from? How can we increase our power? Well, one thing we can do is we can try to increase other people's dependence on us. So how do we make people more dependent on us in the workplace? Well, one thing you can do is you can be really good at your job, be really competent, be indispensable. And if you're indispensable, if you're the only person who can do your job as well as it's being done, then people depend on you, and that's a source of power. We can gain power by decreasing our dependence on other people. So if there's, for example, something at work that you don't know how to do, and you always have to rely on this one person to do it, who knows how to do it, nobody else knows how to do it, one thing you can do to reduce your dependence on that other person is try to learn what they know, so that now you have learned it yourself. You can do it yourself. You're not dependent on them anymore. And part of that might mean building your skills so you're more employable, so that you're not so dependent on your current job. In other words, if you put yourself in a position where other organizations want to hire you and see value in you, then you're no longer dependent on your employer. You can walk away if you need to, and that puts you in a good position in terms of negotiating for things that you want in that job. Develop your professional networks. That's a way to increase your chances of being employable at other jobs. It makes you more likely to be aware of other employment opportunities that are out there. Again, that reduces your dependence on your current employer. Come up with backup plans. Think of what you would do in the event that your position gets downsized or you get fired or whatever else happens. Having a backup plan, even if you don't necessarily have to use it, or maybe you never have to use it, but just having a backup plan makes you more able to avoid negative situations. In other words, if you have a backup plan, you might feel more okay with leaving a really horrible job situation than if you don't have a backup plan. So it's always a good idea to have one. Now, one thing to think about in terms of power is, well, people want autonomy. So if you exert power over other people in a way that takes away their sense of autonomy, what you tend to get is what's called reactance, where they're reacting negatively to that use of power on your part. Nobody likes to be manipulated or bullied or forced or ordered to do things. So we have to be really careful about how we use power. Okay, so there's a number of different specific sources of power, and we'll just kind of go through each of these relatively briefly. So one is positional power, and so some people have power legitimately based on their position in the company hierarchy. So if you're the CEO, you have power over a lot of people. If you're a manager, you have power over your direct reports, but maybe you don't have power over your supervisor. So it's basically limited to the ordinary requirements of your job. In other words, your boss can ask you to do things within your job description that are legitimate, and other things maybe they have less power to do so. Now, this is a sort of the shaky source of power, because your position in the organization could change. Other people's positions in the organizations can change. So your direct report might get promoted, in which case now you have no more legitimate power over them. So we don't want to get too caught up in legitimate power as a source of power. Now, reward power is another form of power, based on being able to give people rewards like bonuses, promotions, awards, just verbal praise, more enriched jobs, jobs that are more interesting, more challenging. These are all kinds of rewards that you might have, and that's can be a good source of power, particularly enriched jobs and praise are pretty effective. But it can backfire when the rewards that you're using are perceived as unfair, maybe by people who aren't getting the rewards. So we have to be a little bit careful with that. Coercive power, comes from being able to threaten or punish people. And this is a really risky form of power because it tends to, when you try to coerce people, you tend to destroy the relationship. Nobody wants to be friends with a bully. And you also, the use of this power also leads to great risk of abuse of the person who's wielding the power. So, we have to be really, really careful about coercive power. Expert power is a form of personal power that's based on having specialized skills, abilities, knowledge, experience, judgment. So, while other people can develop expertise, meaning like, there may be limits to how useful this form of power is. I mean, it's always good to develop your own expertise. Of course, other people can do that too. So it's hard to have unique expertise over long periods of time because other people can learn what you've learned. But generally speaking, it's a good thing to pursue having expertise. We also have referent power, which is based on social identification. So the more people look up to you, the more people want to be part of your social group, the more power you have to influence them. And, this is also fairly a good thing to pursue if it comes naturally. But if you're, trying to be a real influential person, and I don't know much about this, but I suppose that's a thing people do on social media now, is to try to be an influencer. In other words, to try to accumulate referent power. Well, the problem with this is that, or the challenge with this is that you might have to do a lot of image maintenance to keep this up. So if your referent power is based on, sort of marketing yourself as a particular thing, then that might take a lot of effort to maintain that image for other people. And as a general rule, portraying yourself in a way that isn't authentic tends to be fairly exhausting over time and undermining. Generally speaking, not a good idea. Okay, and we have some other source of power I want to just briefly mention. There's informational power, which comes from having control over access to valuable information. There's connection power, which is based on access to professional networks inside and outside of organizations. So again, building your social network is a source of power. There's association power, which is based on knowing people in key positions within the organization. So you may know that to get something approved, maybe you know that it has to go through this one person in this one department, and so knowing that person and knowing who they are and knowing what they like and don't like is a source of power. Forming reciprocal alliances in which you exchange favors with people, that's another source of power. So, for example, if somebody approaches you and says, "Hey, I really want you to support me in this new initiative," and you agree with the initiative, it's a good idea to give them support, because who knows, maybe down the line you'll be in the same position they are, and now they're going to support you in turn. So those kinds of alliances can be a good source of power too. Okay, so that's power. Now, one side effect of power, if you will, is organizational politics. So politics is an attempt to gain resources via informal systems rather than formal systems. So in other words, like you may have certain procedures that are standard within your organization, and politics is when you try to go outside of those normal systems to try to gain resources. And politics exist in every organization, though they do tend to vary in intensity from organization to organization. There's a political climate, which is the ways in which people may be able to work around formal policies and procedures. And a political climate, a climate that's very political, in other words, can be perceived as unfair because, again, there's no standard operating procedures that people are following. It's sort of based on your own networking and how much people like you, and it's not rules based, so it can be perceived as very unfair. But again, it's present to varying extents in every organization. So either you learn to navigate these systems or you end up being abused by them. So of course we all have to learn the politics, even if we may find it distasteful. The choice is, either I learn them and try to make use of them because they're always going to be there, or I pretend it doesn't exist and then I end up being worse off. Okay, so a related topic is ethics. So we talked about how some forms of influence and some forms of power may be associated with some bad outcomes. And one really classic case of this is the case of Enron. So Enron was I guess, energy and technology company, I suppose, maybe an energy company. I think founded in the 70s. In any event, they received many, many accolades as an innovative company. They came up with all kinds of kind of creative ways to manipulate or manage energy markets. Ken Lay was the CEO, Jeff Skilling, the president and chief operating officer. There's Skilling, and Ken Lay is the older gentleman on the right there. Okay, now what's interesting about this case is, and there's by the way, great movie on this called The Smartest Guys in the Room. That's available, I think, for free on the web. Enron refused to disclose how they made their money. And that's a real red flag. They used lots of shady accounting procedures to inflate their revenues. So they looked like they were bringing in a lot more money than they actually were. Now, there was a whistleblower named Sharon Watkins who laid out her concerns to Skilling. And basically, her concerns were relayed to the same legal company that was responsible for the shady deals in the first place. So, in other words, there was no accountability within the organization, or at least the accountability, the people who were in charge of oversight were the same people who were responsible for the ethical breaches. So that's a really bad situation. It all started to kind of fall apart when a Wall Street Journal news story about Enron, the Enron CFO, who was, beyond being the Enron CFO, was also running an external company, which by itself maybe isn't too bad, but that external company was doing deals with Enron that would, those deals would then become part of the revenues that Enron was reported, and yet, they were basically just like kind of paper inventions. There was nothing actually happening. So that's a real red flag. By the way, there's Sharon Watkins on the upper left. Okay, so, and essentially what this resulted in was Enron collapsing because of these, ethical violations. How did it happen? Well, Ken Lay was a really beloved figure, really sort of nice guy. Jeff Skilling was extremely charismatic and intellectually intimidating. That combination was a really bad one. There was a sort of philosophical corruption within the organizational culture. So they viewed themselves as sort of above the rules, coming up with all kinds of creative ways to do accounting and creative ideas about how their business would operate, refusing to disclose how they made their money. These were like kind of really deep, fundamental ideas within the organization. So it was sort of corrupt from the beginning. There are a number of enablers. The banks that they operated with, the lawyers, the analysts. Arthur Andersen, which is now Accenture, was implicated in a lot of these really shady accounting practices. So it wasn't just Enron, it was the people around them. Again, very weak checks and balances in the system. The board of governors of the organization had really, nice qualifications, but they weren't really paying attention. They weren't really doing their job. So it looked like there was accountability. It looked like there were checks and balances, but in reality there weren't. The internal review process was often pitted against the traders, meaning there were people whose job was to prevent or to minimize risk. Those were the internal review people. And then there were the traders who were the ones bringing money into the organization. And Skilling always ruled in favor of the traders. And he probably should not have been the sole arbiter of those kinds of issues. They had an internal legal counsel, but that person would never stand up to Skilling and others within the organization. So they were basically, again, they looked like they had checks and balances, but in reality, they did not. So how do we prevent these kinds of issues? Well, You remember that from way back, maybe in our second week of class, we talked about different ethical decision making rules or self tests for individual decisions. And that's, well and good when you think about trying to avoid ethical problems as an individual manager yourself. But with Enron, what we're really talking about are systems that enable corruption and scandal and ethical problems. And so that's, I think, maybe at the organizational level, a better way to think about this is that you have a system that's set up without the proper checks and balances to prevent corruption and ethical violations from happening. And one way to think of this is what's called a power corruption cycle. So when you have people with power and access to resources with no accountability, and that's arguably the case with Skilling and Ken Lay, a number of things start to happen. So that's when you have power, but no accountability. So you can do whatever you want, and nobody's holding you to account. The problem that you get with that is that you tend to, because you're such an important person and nobody's kind of bringing you down to reality, you tend to find yourself very distanced from your employees. So, they're lowly employees. You don't bother to associate with them or talk with them. So now you're separated from the on-the-ground reality, which your employees are going to be aware of. You also tend to have a very inflated view of yourself because, you're so important and powerful. Nobody can tell you what to do, so you must be, again, the most important person around. So you get an inflated view of yourself. And what happens then from the perspective of your employees? Well, you're so important, you're so powerful that, employees tend to react by being compliant with your requests, by flattering you, by being submissive and dependent on you because you have all the power. You haven't empowered them. They're totally dependent on you. So they're not going to behave as independent actors. They're going to just sort of do the best they can to make sure that you're happy. And that means flattery, compliance, submission, dependence, all of these things. Again, you could see why that would be a real problem in the long term, especially. And all of these things lead to a sense of privilege among upper management. You have very poor decisions because, executives are just completely distant from the on-the-ground reality. They think they can do anything they want. They're constantly being told how great they are. They're never being told the on-the-ground reality that conflicts with their views. They're being flattered, and people they're just saying, yes, boss, I'll do whatever you need. That leads to very poor decisions. It also leads to a tendency to want to coerce people. If you have all the power, then all you need to do is order people around. You don't have to get them on your side. You don't have to convince people. You don't have to use reason. You just order people, and that makes you lazy. Tend to have a low opinion of employees because you have so much more power than them, which again makes it very easy to engage in practices that are unethical because nobody's sort of pointing out, hey, these are the wrong things to do. If you can get away with it, nobody's telling you it's wrong, then you might not even recognize that what you're doing is unethical. And by doing that, then of course you're creating more distance because you're accumulating more power. And so people are going to be even more distant from you and are going to engage in all of these reactions on the part of employees that are really unproductive or dangerous. So, it's easy to blame people like Skilling and Lay, and of course, there's probably good reason to blame them in certain ways. But the important thing to recognize is that given the right situational circumstances, probably anyone can end up engaging in unethical behaviors precisely because we don't perceive them as unethical when we have all the power. And so from an organizational design standpoint, the important thing to do is to try to structure organizations in such a way that you do have real checks and balances so that you don't have this power corruption cycle, that you make sure that your upper level leaders are held accountable, that they are not distancing themselves from their employees, etc. So, rather than thinking of ethics in terms of these individual decision self-tests, which again are good to do, but they may not be sufficient. Rather, we need to make sure that we structure organizations in such a way that we avoid creating the conditions that lead to unethical behavior. So partly as an individual manager, it's important to recognize this, that if you're operating only within a particular system, only within your organization, and all your information is coming from within that organization, and it has these properties of having very powerful leaders who aren't held accountable, then you need to look outside the organization to try to understand how appropriate the behaviors are. Because if you start looking outside your small world within your organization, you may start to realize, oh yeah, the way we do things here is wrong, and we need to stop. Otherwise, there's going to be, we're going to be eventually things are going to catch up to us, just like they did to Enron. Okay, so what are again, to kind of summarize, what are some solutions to the power corruption cycle? Involve leaders in day-to-day activities. So don't allow them to create that distance between them and followers. Reduce followers' dependency on leaders. Increase, employee empowerment. Use objective measures of performance. So there's no way that, upper level leaders can delude themselves into thinking that things are going well. Involve outsiders in decision making. That's really important. That's where the board of governors of Enron really failed them, and that they were outsiders. They just weren't doing their job. Change the organizational culture, and that's really a tall order, and it's always difficult to do. But ultimately, that may be the thing that must be done to prevent the power corruption cycle from happening. And ultimately, some of it is even higher level than that. In other words, it's not just about the organization. We need to have bigger picture kind of interventions, like government regulation. Of course, I'm Canadian, so of course that I'm going to go for that kind of stuff. But having regulation in terms of some of these practices, making it illegal for organizations to engage in certain things that tend to result in corruption. Generally, it's a good idea. Having strong internal oversight processes within organizations, having protection for whistleblowers, having an ombuds person within the organization, for example, whose task it is to listen to complaints and who aren't held accountable. In other words, they're operating somewhat independently within the organization to make sure that all complaints are heard. Giving greater accountability to leaders, in other words, again, making them more in touch with the on-the-ground reality, less arrogant, less distant. Avoid perverse executive incentives based on economic performance. In other words, if you're compensating executives for economic performance, then you're holding them accountable only to performance and not to some of the other longer-term issues. So it was really easy for Enron to have better economic performance by faking, faking revenue that didn't exist, and they'd be compensated for that. That's a lot easier to do in the short term, and you're rewarding them to do that. But in the long term, that's a horrible policy to have as an organization. So those are just some kind of big picture issues or big picture solutions to ethical problems within organizations. Okay, and sadly, Enron is one case around the same time, in the same 2-3 years, we had other massive scandals, ethical scandals at WorldCom, at Tyco. Arthur Andersen was related to the Enron issue, and certainly, plenty of examples in more recent years, including like Wells Fargo, Facebook. The list goes on and on. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. All right, everyone. Thanks for your attention. I hope you found this interesting and useful. I look forward to seeing you next time.